Just a generation ago, the United States was widely seen as the most dominant and influential nation in the world. But lately, there's been a dramatic decline.
The most recent issue of Foreign Affairs magazine asked the question, what happened to the American century? The six-part series delivers, quote, an autopsy of the last decades of American global leadership. For more insight into this edition, Executive Editor of Foreign Affairs, Dan Kurtz-Phelan, is here. Good to see you, Dan.
Thank you so much.
So we were debating this during the commercial break because it's a discussion that Anne-Marie and I have had. I've had this with colleagues, with other friends. Let's start out with the sort of the macro and the macro look at this and the reason why you decided to tackle this subject. What makes some of the writers believe that the American century has passed?
So one thing that we noticed in all of the foreign policy debates we're having today, whether it's about Iran or North Korea or the trade war with China, is that there's this huge difference from where we were just a generation ago. So we stepped back and thought about where the United States was at the end of the Cold War when we talked about a unipolar moment in the United States as an indispensable nation with no challengers to its power, its vision of how the world should work. And so much has changed today. It's a time when we're talking about great power competition, wrestling with competitors everywhere, crises everywhere. And we really wanted to ask, how did we go in this relatively short period of time from this moment when everything seemed to be going our way to where we are now?
So Vlad mentioned this is broken into 6 parts, right? So the first part looks at U.S. dominance, the end of the Cold War, starting with the fall of the Berlin Wall to the collapse of Iraq in 2003. What does the author see as the reason for the decline?
This is a really powerful essay by Fareed Zakaria, the CNN host and former Foreign Affairs editor. And he looks at a couple of strands that go, this essay traces U.S. foreign policy over the course of a couple decades, and he sees a couple of problems that really run through foreign policy across multiple administrations. At the end of the Cold War, first of all, Americans thought that we could kind of step away from the world for a time. We had invested a lot in the course of several decades in really organizing the world, leading the world, and there was the sense that we could spend less, we could do things on the cheap, we could achieve what we wanted, we could keep ourselves safe, but without investing in the same way. And again, we found that really wasn't true. So it was the sense of hubris, as Fareed puts it in that piece, that really got us into trouble again and again, Iraq probably being the most powerful example, but there are plenty of others across administrations.
In the next 2 parts, you take a look at the culture of American finance, and you explain, the author does, how the United States was able to drag the world into a financial crisis. That's happened several times.
That's
but
right.
It's not just the first time back in 2008. We've seen it throughout the course of since the existence of the financial markets, essentially. But what's being done, do you think, to prevent another one? And we have seen some in Britain and in France that have also put the world on edge, but nothing like here.
Yeah, one thing you see across all of these pieces, whether you're talking about foreign policy or the economy, is that parts of the system that were meant to be a servant to broader American society really became a master in their own right. So instead of financial institutions serving the rest of the economy, we got to a point where the rest of the economy was serving financial institutions. Same thing with globalization. There's a piece about what the author calls hyperglobalization. Instead of thinking of trade and interconnection as a force for bringing prosperity and safety to the United States, everything became a servant of more globalization. And you see that in the financial institutions and trade in foreign policy. And the answer to your direct question about whether we're safer, the author of this piece, Gillian Tett, worries that we're starting to get a little bit cocky and a little bit complacent about the risks of another crisis.
So part 5, you've got the writers for part 5, Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson. They write, there is one overriding culprit behind the failure of the U.S. political system, the Republican Party. Why do they say that, and how do they propose it be fixed?
So they look at what they call asymmetric polarization. There was a sense over several decades that the two parties would come together in the middle to compromise on various issues, that there was a fight over the median voter, the voter in the middle, and that would force both parties to compromise for a variety of reasons having to do with geography and inequality and the way institutions have changed in the United States over several decades. One party has had reason to shift further in one direction than the other party has, and that's not so much a moral judgment or a judgment on the substance, but an observation about how the system works when you don't have two parties that have incentives to compromise in the same way. And we really press the two of them to come up with some remedy to this. and remedies to American political dysfunction are few and far between today. But what they really think is that there is kind of a fever that will break at some point, and there will be new incentives, there will be new political alignments that will cause the parties to compromise again. And in some ways, the political moment we have now, where things are changing and there are new alignments and voting blocks that were thought to be in one camp or the other are shifting, that offers some new opportunities to put together a new center.
And we live in a hyper-partisan world today, and someone watching this will say, well, don't the Democrats bear any blame? And we did interview somebody recently when we talked about gerrymandering and the fact that Republicans in the past couple of years have gerrymandered many districts. But the author that we spoke to said, look, it could happen with Democrats if they're in power.
Right.
Each party seeks to embolden and grow its own party. So in other words, if Democrats were in charge, perhaps they might gerrymander districts to make it more advantageous to them. So do Democrats not bear any of the responsibility?
Well, I think that's a very good point. Anyone who can help themselves keep their job is likely to do whatever they can to do so. What I think the risk is now is that there are incentives for both sides to rush to the extremes, and whether that's going to happen over the next 2 years or not, we'll see once the campaign really kicks off today. But that is certainly the risk, and that will affect economic policy, foreign policy, and everything else.
Before we let you go, here's the question that I have, which is there a sense that Americans want to be the American century going forward? Because as we were talking about earlier, before the end of World War II, if you, in this country, if your dad was a farmer or a teacher, that meant if your father was a teacher or your mother was a teacher, that meant they were educated, you might become educated. If your dad was a farmer, you probably would become a farmer and do very well in life. But things shifted after World War II. Young men and women went to college. Their children went to college. Those kids ended up starting Microsoft and Apple Computer, and all those things happened. Now you hear more and more politicians saying coal. The innovation that is happening in other countries, we're not worried about that. We want to continue to make sure that you can work in industries that are no longer viable in this country, and you have people that vote on that basis. So my question is, I guess, do you see Americans as willing and wanting to be the leaders that they were in the post-World War II era? When the president says we got to get rid of NATO, when we're one of the founders of NATO, and the reasons why we founded NATO are still very relevant today, but a lot of Americans say, I don't want any part of that.
You're getting at what I think is a really fascinating and in some ways optimism-inspiring aspect of the moment we're in. For a long time, people who work on foreign policy, myself included, did not feel the need to remind Americans who don't spend their days thinking about the rest of the world why an institution like NATO, why trade agreements, why all the other aspects of American strategy over the last 70 years were really essential to the health and safety and prosperity of the rest of American society. And what this moment has forced people to do is to really go back to basics and talk about fundamental assumptions in a new way. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, how do you win the presidency? You talk about domestic issues. You don't talk about foreign policy.
That's
right?
right.
That's what they're interested in.
Exactly.
Dan, thank you so much.
This was such a fascinating discussion. Please come back and talk to us.
Happily. Thank you.
Yeah.